Hi folks, we're Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about one of the sort of several fateful decisions that Hitler and the Wehrmacht, the German military high command, made during the Russian campaign of 1941 to 1945. Now, what I think is one of the most critical was the meeting that the German generals had, including General Holder from the Army High Command, who'd come over for the meeting on his private train. The meeting they had at a place in Russia called Orsha, which is northwest of Moscow, and this was a fateful meeting in a number of ways, and at least this phase of the war, it was critical in deciding the outcome, in my view. Now, historians are mixed on this. The meeting in November 12th at Orsha, 1941, Orsha, the spelling, and some historians say, well, it was irrelevant and really nothing much happened or didn't happen there. Some historians, and one of them that I'm using as a reference for this is the 1960s. Well, he was quite prolific in the 60s and 70s, Alan Clark, the English historian. And he wrote a history, and I've got that in front of me now. In fact, one of the original printings, Barbarossa, the Russian-German conflict of 1941-1945, which back in the day could have been bought for the princely sum of $1.50, brand new off the shelf. So this is the meeting now. Just to sort of set context, the Germans have just had a huge victory, going almost directly west of Moscow, about 250 k's, 300 k's, give or take, from Moscow. It's called the Battle of Vyazma Bryansk, so Vyazma Vyazma Bryansk, where the Red Army losses were somewhere in the vicinity of 700,000, which includes deaths, injury, serious injury, or the hundreds of thousands, many hundreds of thousands who were captured as prisoners. So across the whole front line, the Red Army were outnumbered at this point. Now, just as the Wehrmacht was sort of finishing off that encirclement, which was huge, a huge military victory in any measure, the rainy season, which precedes the winter in Russia, the rainy season began, and I think it's called the I don't know if I'm getting the pronunciation right. The Rasputita, I think it's called. Anyway, the rainy season began, and given there are so few serviceable roads in Russia at the time, there was only 3 sealed roads going from east to west, and 2 of them were like country lanes, almost, they were so narrow. And there was only one high road or highway there, which of course was being bombed and was difficult, and there's a whole lot of traffic needed to go down. So a lot of the forces needed to go off-road, and in the rainy season, this is a huge thing. Now, having been out on things like mine sites where the roads, the dirt roads, are concrete hard in the dry weather, even a relatively light rain, and given there are tracked vehicles going up all the time, like they are in mines, the roads get turned into a quagmire. It's like 2 or 3 feet full of liquid mud, and so pretty much all operations stop or are slowed down considerably because the roads just are unusable or impassable. Now there are various things in mines you can do, that technology today, putting in steel sort of matting, and there are various things that can be done, but basically things still slow down or stop during that sort of weather. But within an hour or so of the sun coming out and things drying out, the roads are back to being concrete hard again. And it's difficult to imagine just how quickly they go from concrete hard to quagmire back to concrete hard again. but it shows the influence of weather that can have on operations, or military operations in this case. So the rainy season comes, and it rains sort of night and day for a few weeks, and quite heavily, and for about a month, I guess. And then the cold weather begins. Firstly, it's the frosts that harden the ground, but then within a few weeks, the snowstorms and the blizzards come, and it's 40 degrees below, and this sort of thing. So now the rainy season begins at around the time that they're having the meeting, or there's been a bit of rain for a few days. So they're having this meeting November 12th. The decision is, okay, we've just had a great victory at Vyazma Bryansk. We've taken millions of Red Army prisoners. We've inflicted millions of casualties. We've captured thousands of aeroplanes or destroyed them. We've destroyed thousands of Red Army tanks, and so on and so forth. We've captured vast areas of territory. We've disabled numerous factories and other things, other bits and pieces. We've captured a lot of the areas where, in Ukraine, that are used for growing grain. So we're on the verge of victory. But because there's so few roads, and because all the rail lines needed to be changed and to be European gauge, the Germans just weren't able. Their resupply machine, quite apart from having to cover large distances, their resupply machine just wasn't up to the task of A, covering that distances, and B, delivering all the munitions and the supplies needed to maintain that level of offensive operations, particularly when the weather was bad. So a lot of trucks were being used, or even horse-drawn carts were being used to resupply the front lines. But during the rainy season, that completely broke down, and they had to rely just on the trains. There's really only one or two serviceable train tracks, and again, only three quite narrow serviceable roads. So this affected the ability of whereas the Red Army was falling back on their supply dumps, so their supplies were close by and nearby. They had a much better rail network coming behind them, because Moscow was the central rail hub which all rail lines went out of. So the Red Army had much better capability of resupply than the Wehrmacht did. So when they're meeting, the decision is, we've just had a great victory. Do we continue on with this? Do we make the big lunge for Moscow and finish the job here? We're close to victory. We're close. Final victory is close. And then on the other side, the argument was, well, the troops are seriously overstretched because of the rainy season. The supplies that we normally would deliver, if the weather was good and dry, the supplies we can normally get to the front line, we can't. There's a serious undersupply of key. So they've got a choice here. They have, okay, we can supply all the munitions needed to maintain offensive operations. That we can do, but we've got to cut the food rations in half. We can't supply the food. Next, we can't supply the supporting bits and pieces, like replacement boots for the soldiers and coats. The cold weather's coming in. We've got a lot of cold weather gear, but that's pretty bulky, so it uses up a lot of space on the trains and the trucks. So if we start delivering that means we can't deliver munitions. So, or we can deliver all the medical supplies, but we can't deliver that. So they're already at the stage where it's either this or that. They can't supply everything. They just can't. They just don't have the infrastructure or the roads or the rail lines to be able to do it. So what are they to do? And this is part of what's in this meeting that they're having on November 12th. Now, this is only three and a half weeks before the Red Army counteroffensive in December 5th. These are when the Siberian divisions are brought back from Siberia that have previously been fighting the Japanese. And so a lot of these guys have battle experience, and they're quite well equipped. Got a lot of tanks, and they've got good equipment and so on. They've got cold weather clothing and felt boots and all the other bits that you need in cold weather. And so these soldiers are being brought back from Siberia, and they're starting to be deployed around Moscow. And German intelligence has finally caught up with that, and they're realizing that that they're going to have to face a number of these Siberian divisions, which were all fresh and well fed and well clothed and well equipped and so on. So they arrive at this meeting, and this is all the heads of the various armies, mostly chiefs of staff, but also others, the Luftwaffe and the other areas of the supply and ordnance departments. They've got their representatives there, but the senior people are the army people in particular. And again, they're deciding on this. So they're well aware that if they push on to Moscow, they're going to have to do it under overstretched conditions. The troops won't have cold weather clothing, or not enough of it. They'll be on limited rations or half rations. Not a good thing when you're asking soldiers to fight frontline activity. They need to be well fed. So that was an issue. Or this was the other option, or they decide, okay, we can't win it now. We're too late. The rainy season is here. The winter is upon us. It's just going to be too much to push these exhausted, overstretched troops to go chasing after Moscow. No, the sensible thing to do is to dig in, straighten up the line. You're going to have to give up a little bit of ground here and there just to go to a defensible position. Dig defensible, dugouts and trenches. Dig all that and have that defense prepared. And that's, once you stop offensive operations, then suddenly you can bring in a lot of supplies like extra food, medical equipment, medical supplies, cold weather gear, and so on. You still bring munitions in, but you don't expend anywhere near the same amount of munitions when you're putting in a defensive position as if you're going full-on offensive operations. Now, once the cold weather comes in, you can't dig trenches and dugouts anymore. The ground's just too cold. You need specialist digging equipment, which in itself you got to bring in to do. But if you're going to do it with soldiers with shovels, you have to do it before the winter comes in. And this was also known and discussed and put around. So do they take a defensive position and then resume offensive operations the following year once the spring and summer are at hand, or do they push on and what is clearly a high risk? Now they're calculating on balance. They're saying, well, look, the Red Army's taken a terrible beating, which they have. Our troops are victorious and morale is high, which it is. But soldiers on half rations with a very sort of uncertain and tenuous supply line, that's not a good basis for moving ahead. Many of the troops are exhausted. A lot of them, they've got boots that are falling to pieces and coats that have got holes. They're just not in a condition or a shape to go on with offensive operations. But the decision is made, or the calculus is made. Well, the Red Army, okay, we're in bad condition, but the Red Army is even worse condition. They've had their asses kicked from one end of the place to the other. So we can still push on, win the war, and have it all done and dusted by Christmas. Now, Hitler was the view that Moscow should be surrounded, neutralized in effect, particularly its rail hub, so that, cut all the rail links around Moscow. Should be surrounded, but not actually occupied. That was, Hitler was particularly keen for that. So the communication went back to Hitler, and Hitler wasn't actually privy to these discussions. Contrary to popular belief after the war, Hitler really wasn't interfering that much in military operations at the time. He was leaving it to the generals. He wanted to be informed. He was the head of state. Of course, he wanted to be told what was going on, but he wasn't interfering to, you do this, you do that. That wasn't the level of interference that. And a lot of the generals after the war were saying, everything would be fine. It wasn't for that crazy madman. That's not true. Again, Hitler's involvement in the day-to-day stuff was pretty minimal, but he did want to be informed. But they were having this meeting at Orsha without really telling Hitler what was going on. It was just meant to be a minor administrative meeting. It was no big deal. When Hitler did find out that it was a meeting to decide, do they go on or do they dig in defensively, he then entered the thing and said, no, I want the offensive to continue. Now, the information that at the meeting that they'd exchanged, the state of the German troops, the Siberian divisions, the Red Army Siberian divisions coming in, all that sort of stuff, the reduced supplies, our supplies were very low, and so on and so forth. There's questions of whether or not Hitler was really appraised of all that. And, I'd say on balance, he probably wasn't. Nobody wanted to really go to him and say, look, after the great victory at Vyazma Bryansk, we're going to dig in for a defensive, which would have been the sensible thing to do. So Hitler said, no, I want the offensive to go on. So the generals that were really saying, look, I don't think it's a good idea to go on now. It's high risk. The troops aren't up to it. We don't have the supplies. We can dig in, take defensive positions. We can repulse any Soviet Red Army attack easily under those circumstances. And then we can resume offensive operations in 1942 in the spring and summer, where we're almost guaranteed to win at this point. So Hitler says, no, go on, and they do. Now, this to me is one of the huge decisions of the war, massive decisions of the war, because if they had dug in, they could have resupplied it quite easily. They could have taken, well fortified defensive positions. They had enough time to do it. And when the Red Army did do the counterattack on December 5th, then they would have been, the Red Army and Siberian divisions would have been torn to pieces. This would have been the end of the Red Army offensive, and they would have again charged into the well-fortified German positions and would have been torn to pieces. And then come spring, summer next year, the Germans could have won, I think, quite easily. And they wouldn't have suffered anywhere near the losses they did, as it turns out. But nonetheless, the decision was made to push on with it. I regard that as one of the most fateful decisions of the war and that part of the conflict. That if they had dug in, if the Wehrmacht had dug in at that time, they would have, as things played out, they would have destroyed all the Russian units, the Siberian units, and so on. Hundreds upon hundreds of Russian tanks would have been destroyed, and they could have again resumed offensive operations the following year, and I think won quite easily, other things being equal. So in my view, the meeting at Orsha was a pivotal meeting that, had they decided to again go defensive and dig in, that would have meant they would have won the war. And we need to sort of understand that even though the German defeat was sort of total and absolute, we need to really come to grips with the fact that Russian-German conflict was a very close-run thing, and just a few missteps by the Wehrmacht, and that was enough to result in in the end defeat. And I would regard this Orsha meeting even more important than the defeat at Stalingrad. Stalingrad's got a much bigger headline and far more drama to it. But whilst this meeting doesn't have the high, the headline level of drama, it nonetheless was a pivotal moment in the war. And I think this is overlooked by many of the historians that cover it. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.